Hello, my name is Robert Oswald. Michelle Bamberger and I are going to talk to you today about the impacts of gas drilling on human and animal health. We think of gas drilling as a difficult subject that we think of in terms of biomedical research. And one of the ways we like to think of it and model it is as a potential disease process. And try to come at it from that angle. There are a lot of difficulties because we don't know many of the compounds that are used in drilling. We don't know all the exposure pathways, etc. So our idea is that we should use animals as biological integrators of this effect, of any effects that we might see in drilling. So essentially, we're using animals as sentinels of human health. So I'd like to first start with something that we've heard a lot of times from the oil and gas industry, and explore whether it's true or not, and then take off from that in order and see and illustrate the kinds of things that we're interested in exploring. What we've heard many times is since it was used for the first time in the 1940s, hydraulic fracturing of a natural gas well has never been proven to contaminate drinking water. And the first question is this true at all? Is this true? Well, the answer is probably no. There are a number of instances that we know of where hydraulic fracturing itself has probably contaminated drinking water. This in cases in Wyoming, Alberta, Canada, West Virginia, Alabama, etc. And these are usually cases where the wells are drilled in a fairly shallow formation, and when the well is fractured, then hydraulic fracturing fluid can potentially contact the aquifer. There are other cases where they're old abandoned wells, and this allows it to contact the aquifer through the abandoned wells and contaminate drinking water. But most of the exposures that we see and we think about are really not specifically due to the process of hydraulic fracturing. They're due to the whole life cycle of the process. We have to consider every step of the way. The first step, which I don't show you on this slide, really is going back and getting the raw materials, worker and community impacts from just mining the raw materials used in this process. And one of the most important ones for human health is sand. The sand mines in Minnesota and Wisconsin are fairly large affairs, and they put quite a bit of sand in the air, and people breathe this sand, and there's a serious concern about silicosis in that case. But we can go on and look at other parts of the process. The drilling step is one place where you can get a contamination. You're actually, by definition, drilling through the aquifer, and drilling muds, the things that lubricate the bits, can contaminate water. Then the next steps are hydraulic fracturing and all the other ancillary processes associated with that. There are millions of gallons of fluids that are used that have potential to spill on the surface. Casings of the well can break and contaminate the aquifer by the hydraulic fracturing fluid. And there are a number of things that go on that pollute the air as well. There are many compressors and truck trips that put benzene in the air. There's flaring and venting of wells that put CO2 and methane into the air, etc. There are also thousands of truck trips associated with this process. We've seen this on the roads in many areas, particularly Pennsylvania, where we have spent the most time. And they're spewing out quite a bit of benzene, and these are going through areas that are rural and have not previously been subjected to such an intense traffic pattern. So this changes the air quality dramatically in some areas. And then there are impoundment ponds where they start with fresh water and then and then after that they're filled with fluids that flow back from the wells. The fluids that flow back from the well have, at different times during the process, the hydraulic fracturing fluid, which has some very toxic substances in it, but also they have things that come up from the formation itself. These are lots of salts, high-level salts, because actually this shale formation that they're drilling in was an ancient ocean. So you have a lot of salt, you have barium, strontium, radioactive materials, all these things, in some cases, but not all the time, get put in impoundment ponds. These impoundment ponds can leak, the liners can leak, they can overflow in hurricanes, for example, which we've seen recently. Even in big thunderstorms, sometimes these impoundment ponds will leak into the pastures where there are often cows or other animals nearby, wildlife for certain. They're also a source for, well, birds, for example, see them as a source of water and come in there many times. You'll see dead birds in the impoundment ponds. Condensate tanks where they store fluids that come up from the ground. They can leak, they can blow out. Pipelines can leak. And then perhaps one of the most important things is what is going to happen to all of these wells that we're going to drill. Just in the New York and Pennsylvania area, it's projected that we'll have over 100,000 wells. These are poking all of these holes in the ground, and then they'll be there for our lifetimes, for our children's lifetimes, for our grandchildren's lifetimes. And how long will these wells be intact? Well, most of the data suggests that about half the wells fail within 15 to 20 years. So, whereas at the initial parts of the drilling process, perhaps only about 7 or 8% of the wells fail initially, during the lifetime of the well, most of them, or at least half of them, will fail. So we have to worry about not only what's happening during the initial processes of drilling and how they might contaminate our water and air and have health effects, but we have to think of what's going to be the long-term effects of having all this number of wells in our area. So what we'd like to do now is Michelle Bamberger is going to talk a bit about some of the work we've done with animals, and then I'll come back and I'll talk about some of the policy implications after that. Michelle.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, so we are studying the health of animals living nearby drilling operations, not only to determine what is happening to them, but what might happen to us. Oftentimes, animals are on site constantly, especially livestock, so they will have higher rates of exposure to contaminants in the air, water, and soil than will people. And also because of higher rates of breeding and shorter generation times, we are more likely to see health impacts sooner in them than in us. And as we continue to document cases, what we are finding is that in households with children, it is often the children who are the first to become ill. And that could be predicted because of the way that exposure rates work. Children have a higher exposure rate to contaminants in the air, water, and soil than adults do for two main reasons. One is that they eat more food per pound of body weight than adults do, and they also inhale more air per pound of body weight than we do. Also, they have a higher metabolic rate. So for those two main reasons, it makes a lot of sense that children will have higher exposure rates and that we are more likely to see them. So in that sense, children can be used as sentinels as well as animals. Okay, so our approach to this issue of studying health impacts was to do case studies. I'd like to talk for a minute real briefly about what case studies can do and what they can't do. What they cannot do is give us an idea of prevalence, and that's how common are drilling-related health problems in any area. The second thing they can't do is give us cause and effect. But what we can do is record what happened in each case, and we can study routes of exposure, and we can also document links between drilling events and contamination. And I think it's important to remember that case studies are a good way to begin to study changes in health when we're not sure what's happening. And case studies were our first step in our understanding of AIDS and HIV. Okay, so for this study, what we did was collect information in three broad areas. We started off with interviewing owners of both production and companion animals. The production animals were mostly cattle, but we also had goats and chickens in that category. And the cattle were mostly beef cattle. We have more beef cattle herds than dairy herds right now, but dairy herds are catching up. Then companion animals were mostly cats and dogs, horses, and goats, and also llamas. Some people had llamas that were affected. Those three main categories were, the first one was drilling information. So what we got or obtained from each case was locations of gas and injection wells, impoundments, condensate tanks, pipelines, processing and production units. We also got dates of drilling, fracturing, completion, processing and production. The second major category of information that we obtained was in environmental test results. So that was air, water, and soil, anything that was done before drilling as well as after drilling and during drilling. The third broad category was in health records, and we started off with just looking at animals, but we quickly learned that in nearly all of these cases, the owners were sick as well, became sick after drilling started. So we collected both animal and human health data. And then what we did with all of that information was we created a timeline of events. We started out 5 years before drilling so that each case became its own control. Put all that information on there, and then we were able to determine routes of exposure. And what we did with that information, with this slide, you'll see a breakdown of the processes involved in this natural gas development that's going on. And we have 4 on here, but as Robert mentioned early on, when he first started speaking, is the one that we don't have on here, and it's because we don't have any cases particular to that phase, is the sand mining that's going on in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Several studies have shown that it looks like silicosis is occurring, the silica getting into the lungs, causing a lot of problems with the workers. Our concern is that it will also affect communities that are close by these very, very large operations. So if we stick with this long enough, I'm convinced that we will have some cases in that phase 2. But what we've got right here are 4 main areas: drilling, hydraulic fracturing, wastewater, processing, and production. And in the very center are some examples of the animals that I've discussed that we've studied. So let me just say some comments real quickly on this slide, then we'll go on to each of these a little bit more in depth. So in general, we can say that most of the cases had more than one type of exposure. And the second major thing we can say is that as far as percentage of cases in each category, those first 2, drilling and hydraulic fracturing, were approximately 3/4 of our cases, and that was with well or spring water being changed after drilling and or hydraulic fracturing. And when I say changed, I'm not only talking about quality, but oftentimes there was a quantity change as well. The wastewater cases, about 1/3 of our cases had wastewater exposures, and approximately 1/3 had processing and production exposures. Okay, so we'll just look at these a little bit more in depth. So the first one is the one where I mentioned where a lot of our cases fell into that category, the water quality and quantity change. The drilling fluids, pit leaks and spills, again going back to Robert's slide with the impoundments. And I don't know if he had a picture of a drilling muds pit, but that's another thing that could leak. Those are lined too, and they can leak and have spills. If there's a blowout and the fluids are not under control, they can run off the well pad. And also with our recent storms last year with Irene and this year with Sandy, we have heard of the stormwater running off the well pad and these chemicals running off also. Okay, so this is hydraulic fracturing. Again, that first group there with the water quality and quantity change was one of our biggest hits with our cases that were reported to us. Fracturing fluid released from holding tanks. I'll be talking about a specific case that involved that. Again, the fluids can overrun the well pad during a blowout stormwater. There can be casing failures that Robert referred to early on and can affect water quality, as well as flaring and venting. And I think the important thing to keep in mind with flaring and venting is that the gas is released in both cases, but with flaring, it's burned first, and venting, it's not. Okay, so the wastewater exposures, again, wastewater is oftentimes held in large impoundments, and these can have leaks and spills. It's oftentimes spread on the road, listed as a beneficial use by our DEC in the SGICE. It can be dumped on property. We've had several of those cases, as well as dumped into creeks, streams, rivers, and lakes. It's also being injected into deep vertical wells in several states and has been associated in that way with seismic activity. And misting via aerators, that's oftentimes done in a pond pictured on the slide here, where it's very large in an effort to reduce the volume and keep the bacteria to a low level. Can also be stormwater runoff from the impoundment. Okay, in processing and production, we have several cases where the compressor station has malfunctioned and shooting all kinds of chemicals and fluids into the air under high pressure. Pipeline leaks and ruptures. Condensate tanks can also have venting. Volatile organic compounds exist in the condensate tank, and also spills that can run off into nearby rivers and creeks. Okay, so I want to speak briefly about a few cases that we've documented. This is the first case that caught my attention. It occurred in Louisiana in April of 2009, where 17 previously healthy cattle died within an hour following exposure to hydraulic fracturing fluid. So there are two issues here that are important to keep in mind. One is that it's hydraulic fracturing fluid that was diluted, so we're talking about fluid that was 99% or more water. And the other thing that's really important is that these cows died within an hour following exposure. If we do a literature search and look at cattle exposed to petroleum hydrocarbons and look at morbidity and mortality rates, we will see that the timeline on those is usually 1 to 3 days, not 1 hour. So this was a pretty dramatic occurrence. One of the cows was taken into necropsy, and en route, this is the symptoms. These are the symptoms the driver observed in that cow: falling over and kicking, reluctance to move, foaming at the mouth. So the foaming at the mouth could have easily been a sign of pleural edema. Oftentimes the cows will aspirate liquid and get into the lungs and cause an aspiration pneumonia and resulting in the pleural edema. The final diagnosis on the necropsy, most likely cause of death was respiratory failure with circulatory collapse. And even though petroleum hydrocarbons were found in the small intestine, the lesions in the trachea, lung, liver, and kidneys did indicate the presence of toxins. Now, these cattle were exposed to 2 types of quaternary ammonium compounds in the fracturing fluid. One of them was tetramethylammonium. That compound is highly toxic and could easily have caused the lesions that were found in these cattle. Okay, so we were lucky to have some natural control and experimental groups in our study, and this was so because farmers don't oftentimes keep all their cattle in one place. So when an exposure occurs, then we've got 2 groups to compare. In the first case, it was a beef herd that was exposed to wastewater after the liner was allegedly slit. The wastewater ran off the impoundment down the hill and into the pasture and pond where the beef cattle were. These cattle followed the typical morbidity and mortality rate. Many of them died within 1 to 3 days. But this farmer also had a high incidence of stillborn and stunted calves. His part of the herd that was unexposed had no changes in health. The second herd that that fell into this category of being split was actually split into 3 pastures. One of those pastures was nearby a creek, and it was where wastewater was allegedly dumped. This farmer also had several cattle die within 1 to 3 days, but he also had a high number in the survivors that failed to breed back. The unexposed group, 2 groups, had no changes in health. And the third case is a dairy herd that was exposed to affected well water after a casing failure. This farmer in his exposed group had reproductive problems as well, but also had other problems, lameness, mastitis, and a drop in milk production. The unexposed herd, no changes in health. Okay, so what can we say overall for our results? We found it very hard to make definitive links, and Robert is going to come back and talk a little bit more, and this is one of the things that he will discuss, but I'll just mention them briefly. One of the reasons is that we don't know exactly which chemicals were used. We don't know that at this point in time from any drilling operation, exactly which drilling chemicals as well as hydraulic fracturing chemicals are used. We don't know what the interactions between these chemicals are. Oftentimes chemicals can interact with each other, making things stronger or weaker. Also the interactions with things that are in the environment, naturally occurring things that might really be important for health. The third thing is that there was incomplete testing both pre and post drilling. And lastly, because of non-disclosure agreements, definitive health information linking these cases to contamination is not available to us. So what did we find in our, when we looked at all of these timelines for these cases, and we looked at before drilling and after drilling, the major finding for animals, if we took all the animals and counted numbers, was for food animals, both food animals and companion animals. It was in the area of reproduction, and that was failure to breed, abortions, stillbirths, and failure to cycle. With people, there were a set of syndromes that came up repeatedly in our study, as well as we're hearing in other researchers who are looking into health effects in people. And for lack of a better term, we call it shale gas syndrome, and it consists of 5 symptoms here: burning of the eyes, nose, and throat, severe headaches, nosebleeds, rashes, and gastrointestinal problems that include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and cramping. So I think what's important take-home message for everyone out there who's practicing in an area where shale gas development is occurring is to make sure that you have questions similar to what I've discussed on your intake form, but definitely include questions about these specific set of symptoms I've mentioned here, especially looking at time periods after the drilling started. So if they're close to an impoundment, was there a problem with the impoundment? Or even if there's not, have they suffered these problems since that started, or drilling started, or fracturing started? Look at distances. In our cases, all of our cases that we have so far, now we have almost 3 dozen, we're continuing to document, but all of those cases are within 2 miles of where the exposure occurred. So the drilling pad, the impoundment, the compressor station, all within 2 miles of that. So I can't urge you enough to make sure this gets on your intake form. Okay, so I'd like to talk briefly about food safety, which we feel is very important. With our study, in my mind, one of the big things that came out was that we have had now about a dozen herds of production animals, yet only one of those herds was quarantined. All of the herds have been exposed to affected air, water, or soil, but again, only one was quarantined. Again, quarantine meaning held back from the food supply for a certain period of time based on the chemical exposure that was determined. So again, looking at this is that the farms in areas with known exposures as well as farms downstream and downwind, are still producing food products without testing of the plants, animals, or the products. So this gives rise to two questions, and this is probably the area that we get the most questions on from the public. The idea of food safety. Could I be becoming sick because I'm getting food from areas where this process is occurring is really on a lot of people's minds. So the first question is, how safe are these food products coming from these farms where known exposures have occurred, as well as other farms that are downstream and downwind? And the second question is, how safe is the rendered flesh from exposed cattle? Now, the rendered flesh is used to feed pigs and chickens. So even if you don't eat beef, if you say, okay, I'm not going to eat beef, so I won't have that exposure, this is still going to work its way easily into our food supply. So what are the answers to these questions? The big answer is we don't know, and we don't know for several reasons. The first one is that there is inadequate federal funding for food safety research in this country, specifically that related to chemical contamination. There is also inadequate pre- and post-harvest and pre- and post-slaughter testing. So people are often saying, can I test my cow to make sure that milk is going to be okay before I send it to market? Right now, we don't have a test for that. And the third big thing is that there are no experimentally determined hold times for many of the chemicals used in drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Now, a hold time is the amount of time that an animal is held back from slaughter after exposure to a chemical. The chemical could be an antibiotic that I as a veterinarian give, it could be a pesticide, but it could also be one of these chemicals that is used in drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And until we have answers to all these questions that I've brought up here, the public health is at risk over both the short and the long term. And I'm going to turn it back over to Robert, and he'll go into a little bit more depth on some of these issues.
All right, so what are some of the issues? Well, one of the most important things is that we really need to know what the human and animal health impacts are. As I said at the beginning, the way we try to model this is more as a putative disease outbreak. That is, we don't know it as a disease, but to take the steps that you might do when you see a new disease. First thing you might do is case studies. To understand what the exposures are, what the potential problems are. And that's how we feel that our study that Michelle described fits in here. The next step we believe is important is some epidemiology to see, what is the prevalence of problems. There has been some insight into prevalence by Elaine Hill, who is a graduate student at Cornell University, who studied the effects on low birth rate and premature births, and she finds that in humans there's a association between proximity to a well pad and premature births or low birth weights. So again, we've seen reproductive problems in animals. She's seeing some similar or effects in humans, but this is an epidemiology study where she's seeing about a 20% increase in these problems, which is very, very significant. Okay, we believe that because of all the public policy decisions should be based on science. But right now we have only the rudimentary understanding of the health impacts of high volume hydraulic fracturing, and we need to know more. That brings me to an important point, and that is, where does the burden of proof lie? Well, we all think about the pharmaceutical industry a lot and giving drugs. The way as everyone knows, the way the pharmaceutical industry works is they have to get approval for a drug from the FDA. Now, the way that works generally is that the null hypothesis is that the drug is not safe and the drug is not effective, and the company has to prove that it's safe and effective. And there are very specific things that have to be done, very specific steps of testing to show that it's been done. But really, the statistical burden of proof is on not approving the drug. That is, the statistical bias is toward the safety of the public, not drug approval. In this case, we turn that paradigm around. The burden of proof has not been on the industry to prove that this process is safe. The burden of proof is on the public, on academic scientists, on government scientists, to show that perhaps it's not safe. But the statistical bias is against the environment and for drilling. So it's biased toward going forward with the process, not biased toward the safety of the public. So I think we need to think more carefully about this and perhaps shift some of the burden of proof toward the industry, perhaps following something more like an FDA model where we have steps that need to be proven to show that it's safe. Because at this point, there's no really good evidence that the process is safe. Okay. So what are some of the other issues? Well, one of the things I want to talk a little bit about are non-disclosure agreements, because we've had a number of cases where we haven't been able to learn more about what went on because of legal agreements between landowners and companies. So what happens is that a homeowner might have their water contaminated, and in order to receive compensation from the company that contaminated their water, they have to sign an agreement saying that they will not talk about this case. This effectively seals the case so that no researcher can go in and look and see exactly how their water got contaminated and perhaps how their health was affected by that water. Now imagine if a pharmaceutical company that had a drug on the market, that they started seeing that it was causing heart attacks and people were dying. Now, if that pharmaceutical company went to those people and said, okay, or not to the people, went to the families of those people and said, well, we'll compensate you for the death of your loved one if you sign an agreement and not talk about it. In other words, try to keep the drug on the market by silencing the problems, by paying the people off and silencing them. This would be considered unethical. Yet this is something that goes on in other industries, in this industry in particular. So we believe that non-disclosure agreements should not be legal in cases involving public health issues. Of course, it includes drug side effects, but it also should include health issues associated with drilling. Okay, now testing. Michelle alluded to pre- and post-drilling testing. This is something that's being done a bit more than it used to be. But one of the problems is it's being done sporadically, and homeowners are not always able to get at the results. The results are often owned by the industry or by the state agencies, and they're not always able to get access to tests before drilling or after drilling, which limits their ability to make decisions, limits their ability to, perhaps begin legal proceedings. Also, the testing has been somewhat incomplete. One of the things that we would like to see is at least some testing of the specific compounds that are used in hydraulic fracturing pre-drilling and post-drilling. The problem is we don't always know what's being used to drill the well or to fracture the well. The reason for this is that it's not disclosed by the company, and even in their now they do disclose on a voluntary basis some of the chemicals used on a site called Frac Focus. About 30% of the chemicals that are being used are being disclosed on that site, but the problem is they are disclosed after the well is completed, that is, after it's being put into production. So that information cannot be used for pre-drilling testing. What we need to know is what the companies are using to drill the well so we can do pre-drilling testing, and that testing should be available to anybody that lives in the area, as well as first responders and medical professionals in the area. Okay, and there's one other point that I'd like to make about that, and that is that one of the problems is, one of the reasons why only a small number of the chemicals that are used, or only a percentage of the chemicals that are used, are actually disclosed on the website, is that some of the chemicals' names are withheld because they're considered proprietary. In our view, once a company puts a chemical in the ground that can contaminate our aquifer, they should lose their ability to consider something a proprietary chemical. This is something that should be disclosed if it comes in contact with our drinking water. Okay, so how do we even then interpret tests? That's another important point. Air testing is very difficult to interpret, but let me talk a little bit about water testing. In water testing, you have a maximum contaminant level. That is, at the amount of a substance in the drinking water above which health effects are assumed. The problem is that many of the compounds that are used in drilling don't have scientifically based MCLs, or maximum contaminant levels. Those that do are based on high-dose toxicology studies. And I think anybody that knows a little bit about pharmacology or biochemistry realizes that compounds can have different effects at different concentrations. So low-dose effects can be equally concerning as high-dose effects, and could be more concerning in some cases. So this is particularly the case for endocrine disrupting chemicals. So we really don't have good standards for judging the safety of drinking water. The other problem is those compounds that don't have maximum contaminant levels. In some state agencies, it's considered, if they don't have a maximum contaminant level, then they can't take action on that water, and nothing is done. So if something is being used in the drilling process, or something is suspected to come up from the formation, it should have an MCL value that's enforceable, and that MCL value should reflect both high and low dose scientific studies. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of MCLs is the fact that we know almost nothing about what happens when two chemicals, someone is exposed to two chemicals that are perhaps even similar, say two volatile organic chemicals. There are some studies in the literature about this, but they're not that many. So we know very little about interactions between chemicals used in this process. So even though something has an MCL, if it has another compound that is additive or acts synergistically with that compound, that MCL may be totally meaningless. So we need to know more about what compounds are there and what their interactions are. And that's one of the major problems we have right now. Okay, there are a number of other issues that we believe are important, and some of these relate very importantly to health. This process produces quite a bit of wastewater. The recycling processes have improved this so they can reuse some of the water, and this has decreased the amount that's gone into a wastewater stream. The problem, however, is that recycling does concentrate some of the contaminants, and in fact has created somewhat of a problem of disposing of radioactive materials. So how do they get rid of the wastewater? Well, the wastewater has been injected into injection wells. This works reasonably well in some areas. The problem is in areas such as New York and Pennsylvania, the geology is such that it's a little bit more problematic. In fact, in New York, we had one of the early examples of an earthquake caused by an injection well. This was in 2001 in Avoca, New York. There have more recently been injection wells causing earthquakes in Ohio, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and a few others. So that's a possibility that their wastewater has been sent to water treatment plants. We know from studies in Pittsburgh that the wastewater that has been sent to water treatment plants has increased the levels of bromides in the Monongahela River, and which has caused quite a bit of concern. Once the practice was decreased by a voluntary moratorium, the river now seems to be coming back. So going through water treatment plants that are not set up for treating this waste is extremely problematic. And then finally, I could talk a bit about what's called beneficial use, and that is in New York and at least in Pennsylvania, there are proposals in New York and there are laws in Pennsylvania that allow drilling wastewater to be spread on the roads. There is some testing of what gets spread on the roads, but it can be used for suppression of dust or melting ice. The testing is fairly minimal, and it's not certain whether this is going to cause a problem or not. But there is a bigger problem, and that's shown on this slide, and that is what's been called midnight dumping. That is just releasing some of the wastewater on the roads. This actually was, what I show in this slide was an example of actually midday dumping. We personally watched the wastewater hauler dump the wastewater on this road. What I can't show you is how bad this road smelled. There were many volatile organics clearly in what they spread on the road, and what you don't see here is the duck pond that ran into. So this is a serious problem, because if we don't have proper enforcement of our regulations, we're going to continually have problems like this, because it's expensive to dispose of wastewater, and it's not expensive to dump it illegally. And if somebody is not watching, it's fairly easy to do this. And we've seen it with our own eyes. Other people have seen it, and there have been a number of court cases recently where people have been caught doing this. So this is always going to be a serious concern, and it's going to require much, much better regulations and enforcement of regulations. Okay, what are some of the other issues? Well, increased truck traffic is an extremely important point that communities in drilling areas have had to deal with. That comes in a number of different flavors. One thing is truck traffic is usually by diesel trucks, and diesel trucks release a lot of benzene, contaminating the air. The other problem is just the noise and the frustration of being in truck traffic can be psychologically difficult. If this happens day in and day out in areas where it's rural and people are not used to this is a very big change in lifestyle, and has many, many issues that we need to deal with. There are other things such as housing values. We've seen people lose their homes because they no longer have any drinking water. The other issues are the cost of renting an apartment, for example, in drilling areas tends to go up dramatically, and which pushes people of low income out. And essentially what we have is a group of rural people who are essentially homeless. They don't have anywhere to go because the prices of housing have gone up so high that they're simply just staying on people's couches and trying to get by. So finally, I want to leave you with one point that really concerns me quite a lot, and that is this idea of what are the economics of the process. Well, we've been in areas, drilling areas, where you can look around and you could see people who have clearly done very well with this. They have new barns, they have new tractors, they can afford to pay their doctors, and they have good health care. So in their cases, drilling probably actually has increased their ability to obtain health care, maybe in some ways has improved their health. But there are also people in those same areas who are seeing the impacts of drilling, who have had their water contaminated, who are breathing the air that has been polluted. They're receiving no compensation for this, and in fact having to buy their own water. Even some very desperately poor people we've seen have had to simply buy their own water and try to get by. These people are the economic losers, and we're concerned about not only their health, but also, of course, the health of their animals. So I just want to leave you with the idea that this is not just a health issue, this is an issue of economic and environmental justice. So the last thing I want to say is something that this is a quote from our paper, that without rigorous scientific studies, the gas drilling boom sweeping the world will remain an uncontrolled health experiment on an enormous scale. And just let me emphasize one point about that. This is not an issue that's simply something that's happening in the United States. This is a worldwide issue. People are concerned about this process in all parts of the world. We've talked to people all over Ireland, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, France, Canada, etc. This is something that not only our country is going to have to deal with, the health effects of this process, but people all over the world. Thank you.